March 8, 1943. North Atlantic, 300 miles southeast of Greenland. The sea was pitch black and the wind tore across the waves like razors. On board U-744, Captain Lieutenant Heinz Blish was hunched over the Enigma machine, fingers twitching as he encoded a routine status report to BDU, U-boat command back in Lorient. The convoy he had been shadowing for 2 days, HX-229, was zigzagging erratically, unaware they were being stalked. Blish's orders were simple: hold position, maintain radio silence unless vital, and wait for the rest of the Wolfpack to close in. But engine trouble in the starboard diesel was threatening his ability to hold pace. He broke protocol. The message he sent was brief, 2 bursts of Morse, wrapped in encrypted cipher, routine in tone, catastrophic in consequence. It was transmitted at 22:09 and lasted 83 seconds. Somewhere, far to the west, in a squat gray building outside Washington, D.C., the antenna array at Vint Hill Farm Station snapped to life. U.S. Army Signal Corps officers, trained in the art of HF/DF, high-frequency direction finding, logged the transmission within seconds. Simultaneously, a twin station in Gander, Newfoundland registered the same signal. A third in Scotland confirmed the triangulation. By midnight, analysts at Bletchley Park had flagged the Enigma pattern as a variant they were actively decoding, Shark, the Kriegsmarine cipher version used exclusively by Atlantic U-boats since early '42. But tonight, the odds were shifting. Unknown to Blish, earlier that month the British had made a breakthrough. The Royal Navy had captured U-559 off the coast of Egypt in a harrowing operation where 2 sailors drowned retrieving the codebooks. Those codebooks, soaked, half-decayed, had allowed Alan Turing's bomb machines to finally make consistent progress on Shark. The result was a trickle of decrypted traffic that now turned into a torrent. At 4:27 the next morning, a decoded fragment confirmed Blish's position, patrol route, and intended rendezvous with other U-boats from Grupp-Raubgraf. It wasn't just U-744. It was an entire coordinated attack group, 13 U-boats threading a needle through the convoy lanes. For months, Admiral Karl Donitz had orchestrated these wolfpacks with brutal efficiency. Convoys were overwhelmed at night, ships torpedoed in succession, survivors drowning in freezing waters, their distress signals swallowed by static. But now, for the first time, the Allies weren't reacting to attacks. They were preempting them. In Londonderry, HMS Tay was already underway, escorted by 2 corvettes and a squadron of newly outfitted Swordfish aircraft equipped with radar and lee lights. Their orders came directly from Western Approaches Command: intercept, isolate, and destroy. American destroyer USS Bogue, part of a hunter-killer group, was rerouted mid-patrol. The codebreakers were no longer just decoding history, they were shaping it in real time. By noon on March 9, U-744 was 80 miles from the convoy, but instead of prey, Blish found a wall. A triangulated sweep of surface ships and aircraft emerged from the mist like ghosts. He crash-dived to 120 meters. For 12 hours they hunted him, echo-ranging across thermal layers, dropping depth charges that sent shockwaves tearing through the hull. His batteries were dying. Compressed air reserves dwindled. At 23:02, U-744 surfaced, surrounded. Blish gave the order to scuttle. The crew was taken prisoner. The wreck sank slowly, still smoldering, but the real prize had been won hours before: location, strategy, weakness. And the radio transmission that betrayed them all. Across the Atlantic, the implications were staggering. If Enigma was compromised, and the Allies could decode messages within hours instead of weeks, then every patrol route, every U-boat refueling schedule, every rendezvous was a potential death sentence. The hunter had become the hunted. In Berlin, Donitz was skeptical. He believed his Tritonets system of short, encoded bursts made interception virtually impossible. But the evidence mounted. U-boat losses in March alone exceeded 30 vessels, over 1,500 trained submariners gone in a month. By April, that number climbed. The Kriegsmarine's shadow war was unraveling. One message, one burst from a malfunctioning engine, had triggered a chain reaction of interception, decryption, and destruction. And worse, it had proven something terrifying to the Germans: the Allies weren't lucky. They were listening. Back in Bletchley, women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, WRENs, typed furiously at Type-X machines, decrypting fresh intercepts every hour. They weren't just clerks. They were the quiet engines behind the greatest intelligence war in history. It was their translations that allowed Admiral Max Houghton to reshape convoy tactics, to thread safe passages through the Atlantic minefield. Houghton's new doctrine was surgical. Using decrypted traffic, he formed roving hunter-killer groups that no longer traveled with convoys. They went straight to the source. Instead of playing defense, they took the fight to the U-boats. By May 1943, turning point known as Black May had begun. 43 U-boats were destroyed in 30 days. For the first time, Donitz withdrew all wolfpacks from the North Atlantic. It was a silent retreat, unannounced, shrouded in secrecy. The radio transmissions that once coordinated attacks now summoned survivors back to port. But even that was perilous. The Allies had mapped their routes. Supply submarines, Milchku, were hunted down mid-ocean. Bases in Brest and Lorient were bombed nightly. Fuel, torpedoes, morale, all drained. The message that started it all, those 83 seconds from U-744, became a case study in what would later be called signals intelligence dominance. The Germans called it Funkaufklärung. The Allies simply called it Ultra. And it wasn't just about cracking a code. It was about the ripple effect of a single lapse in protocol, magnified through antennas, decoded through circuits, translated by tired hands in a country house in Buckinghamshire. The war in the Atlantic had been decided not by steel or shells, but by sound waves, mathematics, and discipline. U-boat aces who once prowled with impunity, like Otto Kretschmer and Gunther Prien, became relics of a dying doctrine. Radio silence, once a suggestion, became sacred. But by then it was too late. The Allies had adapted faster. Machines had outpaced men. And the vast, lonely ocean that once sheltered the wolfpacks now amplified every mistake. In the years to come, historians would debate what ended the U-boat menace. Some said it was technology, radar, hedgehogs, and sonobuoys. Others claimed it was sheer attrition, the outproduction of ships. But those who were there knew the truth. The shift began with a voice, broadcast in code, bouncing across the ionosphere. One captain, one transmission, one message too many. In war, awareness is everything. And for once, the Allies knew exactly where to look. May 6, 1943. The North Atlantic swell heaved beneath HMS Broadway as she surged through gale-force winds under low grey skies. Depth charge racks on her stern rattled with each pitch of the destroyer's bow, while the Type 271 radar antenna spun rhythmically above the bridge. Orders had come through just after dawn: proceed at flank speed to intercept a suspected refueling operation between U-650 and U-463, a Milchku supply boat. Bletchley had decrypted a short-range burst the night before, revealing a narrow 4-hour rendezvous window at grid square BE 3198. There had been no debate. Houghton's Western Approaches Command mobilized instantly. Every second counted, not just to stop the refueling, but to strike at the very heart of the Kriegsmarine's invisible logistics chain. Without their fuel tankers, U-boat range would shrink dramatically, limiting operations and forcing captains to break off promising ambushes. At 10:22 a.m. dark shape broke the surface 10 nautical miles off Broadway's port bow. It wasn't the supply boat. It was U-650, surfacing to establish visual contact. The crew had no idea they'd already been tracked for over 48 hours. Broadway's radar had painted them the moment the conning tower broke through the waves. Her guns were ready. But Houghton had issued new orders: where possible, capture. Live crews meant intelligence, and intelligence meant more victories. Within 18 minutes, after warning shots and aggressive maneuvering, U-650 crash-dived and was subjected to a punishing depth charge run. The sonic reports showed severe damage. Oil slicks surfaced. Bubbles. And then silence. Another boat lost. Another gap in the Wolfpack network. But it wasn't just in the Atlantic. Hundreds of miles south, over the Bay of Biscay, RAF Coastal Command was waging a parallel war. Bristol Beaufighters, long-range B-24 Liberators, and newly equipped Mosquitoes patrolled the known transit corridors between France and the mid-Atlantic patrol grids. They didn't wait for transmissions. They used decoded rendezvous points and fuel estimates from Enigma decrypts to simply be there, waiting, when U-boats surfaced. One by one, the U-boats fell. Not in fair fights, but ambushed the moment they reached for the sky. The Luftwaffe attempted to retaliate. Ju-88C heavy fighters were assigned to U-flak groups, combined arms missions intended to provide aerial cover for the retreating U-boats. But they were too few, too late. Allied radar was more effective. Ground-based HF-DF stations, floating radar pickets on destroyers, even aircraft with early ASV-Mk3 radar, all of it networked into a single intelligence picture. The Germans called it das unsichtbare Netz, the invisible net. The Allies called it coordination. Back at Bletchley, the success created its own kind of chaos. Wrens had to operate the bomb machines around the clock. Every intercepted message was now vital. Even mundane weather reports from U-boats gave away operational windows. Each transmission revealed not just position, but rhythm. A commander who signaled every 3 days. Predictable. A wolfpack that drifted off schedule. Vulnerable. The British began assembling entire convoy routes designed to lure U-boats into trap zones, pre-measured sectors where hunter-killer groups waited with radar-guided munitions and sonar buoys. On the German side, paranoia crept into every decision. Dönitz was convinced there was a traitor in BDU. He ordered internal investigations. He reshuffled cipher officers. He doubled down on discipline. But he still refused to believe Enigma was broken. It wasn't until the third week of May that he finally authorized drastic changes, longer message intervals, shorter bursts, tighter formations. But it was too late. The Allies weren't just decoding messages. They were inside the tempo of the Kriegsmarine's entire operational doctrine. On May 20th, the USS England sank U-466 in the Central Atlantic. 2 days later, it sank U-1224. Then U-848. Then U-490. By June 1st, England had racked up 6 kills in 12 days. None of them were chance encounters. Every position had been informed by radio intercepts. Not direct decrypts, but traffic analysis. Even encrypted bursts gave away time stamps, signal strength, and travel corridors. Pattern recognition. Timing. Tempo. It was a war of signals now. And in that war, the Allies were gods. And yet, despite the technological advantage, it remained a human war. On May 28, a decrypted signal indicated U-764 was drifting due to mechanical failure near the Azores. A Canadian Sunderland patrol aircraft was dispatched. When the U-boat was located, it attempted to surrender, waving signal flares. But the crew misinterpreted a visual from the aircraft. Gunfire erupted. The Sunderland opened fire with its nose-mounted cannons. The boat exploded. Only 7 survivors. Later, it was revealed the captain had been attempting to broadcast surrender. The Allies now had to grapple with a new problem: how to end a war they were already winning without pushing enemy crews to die uselessly. In a single month, over 90 U-boat crewmen were captured. These were no longer ordinary POWs. They were walking hard drives. The Royal Navy's secret interrogation facility at Latimer House processed each of them, cataloguing routines, cipher changes, morale, even slang terms used in communication. Everything mattered. One sailor offhandedly mentioned Tun Banjurat, a tape recording machine used to replay encrypted signals for training. That detail alone prompted a sweep of U-boat bases for acoustic signature captures. The British now hunted not just by position, but by the very audio fingerprints of enemy gear. By June 1943, the ocean had transformed. Convoys sailed with higher confidence. Loss rates dropped to less than 1%. The average U-boat patrol success had shrunk to below a single ship sunk per voyage. Radio operators began refusing to key up. Commanders who once believed in Germany's invincibility now viewed their periscopes like tombstones. The very act of transmitting had become an act of suicide. Allied intercept stations didn't need full messages anymore. They could detect U-boats before they finished their calls. The airwaves had become lethal. The Allied leadership knew the tide had turned. Churchill called Ultra, "my goose that lays golden eggs." Eisenhower relied on intercepts to plan transatlantic troop movements. MacArthur requested cross-theater coordination for Pacific HF/DF lessons. What began with a handful of technicians intercepting a routine report in March had now become a total war apparatus of radio dominance. The entire Atlantic, once a haven for silent predators, was now an arena of exposure. To speak was to die. To signal was to be seen. And through it all, one fact remained constant: without that single intercepted message, U-744's last transmission, the Allied network might not have coalesced in time. That 83-second burst had given the Allies the proof they needed to go from cautious defense to strategic offense. It wasn't just a lucky catch. It was the hinge point of the Battle of the Atlantic. A brief, encrypted whisper across the waves that had screamed loud enough to change the war. June 2, 1943. Deep beneath the surface west of Ireland, U-241 ghosted silently through thermoclines in the Atlantic's icy layers. Her commander, Captain Lieutenant Gunther Pfeiffer, held his breath, not from fear, but from the almost sacred silence that had become doctrine. No transmissions. No signals. No Morse. No contact, unless ordered. After the catastrophic losses of the previous month, Donit's order was clear: discretion over coordination. The network was collapsing. Of the 44 boats dispatched in May, 25 had been lost. The wolfpacks were no longer hunting. They were being hunted. U-241 had been part of the planned Ritter patrol line, meant to ambush Convoy SC-122, a slow eastbound group of freighters crawling out of Halifax. But there had been no contact for days. Allied aircraft swarmed the skies in 12-hour shifts, dropping radio sonobuoys and patrolling with magnetic anomaly detectors. Every wake was a risk. Every snorkel bubble a death sentence. Pfeiffer had ordered radio silence 3 days ago. It was maddening. His crew, already demoralized from the stories of failed patrols, now sat idle, submerged, in cold metal silence, relying on stale air and guesswork. Above them, the Allies were no longer guessing. Thanks to Ultra, they knew Ritter's exact formation. Using decrypted contact logs, they predicted the most likely fallback routes, the boat's average fuel consumption, and even which captains were likely to disobey silence orders. They didn't need to wait. They simply calculated. The Royal Canadian Navy had dispatched Escort Group C2, a group of Flower-class corvettes, and the destroyer HMCS St. Laurent, to flood the predicted lanes with sonar and depth charge spreads. The ocean, once vast and unknowable, had become a grid. A spreadsheet of attrition. Pfeiffer surfaced briefly just after midnight to ventilate the boat. His radio officer, Oberfunkmart Lang, begged for permission to transmit a weather update. Just a short one. Pfeiffer refused. He had seen the kill list. He knew that even a 2-second burst could be triangulated within minutes. What he didn't know was that 400 miles away, in a converted stable outside Bletchley Park, a wren named Audrey Bishop had already flagged U-241's last known trajectory. Not from a signal, but from metadata, past burst times, fuel estimates, zigzag probabilities. The codebreakers were no longer waiting for messages to be decoded. They were predicting behavior. It was mathematics. And it was working. By dawn on June 3, U-241 was back below 100 meters, batteries draining, oxygen thin. Her sonar picked up distant propellers. Then more. Too many to be chance. Pfeiffer dug deeper, brushing 160 meters, testing the limits of his hull. The charges began falling an hour later. Controlled, systematic, spaced to herd rather than destroy. They wanted survivors. The Royal Navy had orders: disable, then capture. Another hole in the net. Another intel source. The U-boat twisted through underwater valleys, trying to shake the pursuers. But the sonar operators aboard HMCS St. Laurent had been trained using captured U-boat acoustic profiles. They weren't just chasing sounds. They were following a known signature. After the sixth pass, water began leaking into compartment 4. Pfeiffer gave the order. Scuttle. Surface. Abandon. The boat broke water just before noon, crew spilling out, arms raised. A boarding party from the corvette HMCS Drumheller was alongside within minutes. They found intact documents, cipher wheels, and a punched-out Enigma rotor left jammed in the machine. Lang had tried to destroy it, but hadn't finished. That rotor would become Exhibit A in proving once and for all that even the upgraded Enigma, designed to restore confidence, was compromised. The capture of U-241's gear confirmed what the Allies had already suspected: the Germans were running out of options. Multiple captains had reverted to older cipher keys. Others were attempting to use disguised weather formats as a communications layer, coded within the code, as Donitz liked to say. But the British had already decoded that system weeks earlier. Every adjustment made by the Kriegsmarine was reactive. Every innovation had a tail of predictability. The war in the Atlantic was no longer about surprise. It was about inevitability. Back at Bletchley, the analysis teams took U-241's materials and compared them to months of intercepts. Patterns emerged. A set of phantom signals from April now made sense. They were training transmissions from U-241's sister boat. A series of low-power bursts assumed to be equipment faults were reclassified as test patterns. The net tightened further. Horton's fleet reconfigured escort schedules. The Americans adjusted their Liberty ship routes. An RAF Coastal Command laid a new sonar buoy pattern designed to intercept boats using the U-241 escape method, deep diving into underwater canyons west of Ireland. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Donitz convened his senior signals officers in a secure room beneath the Reich Chancellery. There, over a map littered with black excess representing sunken U-boats, he delivered the verdict he had resisted for 2 years. Enigma was no longer enough. He ordered the development of the Triton system, what the Allies would later call Shark. It was to be the most complex encryption platform the Kriegsmarine had ever used, involving 4 rotors, plugboards, and randomized key sheets for every single message. But it would take time, weeks, maybe months. And until then, every signal sent was a risk. Every whisper from the deep could become a scream on Allied airwaves. In the weeks that followed, the British launched Operation Musketry, an expanded hunter-killer initiative focused on clearing the Bay of Biscay. It wasn't just about defense anymore. The war had flipped. Now the Allies were on offense. Using signals intelligence, acoustic triangulation, and even weather forecasts cross-referenced with U-boat logistics, they began actively seeking out and destroying the last remaining resupply chains. The Luftwaffe, now stripped of long-range aircraft and fuel, could no longer provide cover. The sea lanes belonged to Ultra. And yet, even as the Allied group tightened, a strange respect grew among some captors and captives. British officers, interrogating captured German radio men, marveled at their precision, their knowledge of physics, their craftsmanship. In one case, a German NCO was caught carrying a hand-drawn map of every known Allied sonar frequency. He'd memorized them by heart. It was the mark of a professional. And it underscored one painful truth: this wasn't a war of fools. It was a war of equals, outpaced not by bravery or commitment, but by code. By mid-June, losses had accelerated. The Kriegsmarine began pulling boats from the Atlantic entirely. Donitz redirected resources to defend Norway, the Baltic, and the Arctic convoys. For the first time since 1939, the North Atlantic was no longer contested. The convoys steamed through with less than 0.5% attrition. Liberty ships arrived faster than they could be sunk. Troops and fuel poured into Britain. And behind it all, unseen, uncelebrated, stood the operators who had intercepted, decrypted, and understood the whisper that had started it all. Because U-241 never meant to be heard. But its silence had been just loud enough. It was in Room 40's successor, Hut 6, that the analysis turned to something deeper than interception: correlation. While decrypted messages gave immediate tactical gains, the real power was in trend modeling. Signals not intercepted became just as telling as the ones that were. U-boats were trained to check in at strict intervals. When boats failed to report, the Allies didn't just assume they were destroyed, they began mapping patterns in silence. Gaps weren't voids. They were signatures. Allied analysts built ghost patterns from those missing messages, predicting when and where boats would surface, how long they could remain submerged, and when desperation would force a captain's hand. Meanwhile, Donitz, under increasing pressure from Hitler, ordered the reactivation of several long-range U-boats equipped with the new Metox radar detectors, hoping they could sniff out Allied patrol planes. It was a gamble. The Metox sets could pick up RAF-ASV radar emissions, but they emitted their own faint signature when powered. What no one in the Kriegsmarine realized was that the British had already developed counter-detectors. A Mosquito or Liberator would fly low, radar off, wait for a Metox pulse, and home in. Metox, meant to save U-boats, became a beacon. The fatal irony wasn't lost on Admiral Sir Max Horton. In memos sent to the Admiralty, he compared Metox to a candle in a blackout. But the deeper revelation came from what Metox receivers revealed about German tactical psychology. Some captains still believed they held the advantage. They pushed into high-risk lanes, assuming Allied convoys would scatter at first sight. But the age of fear had passed. Now it was about trap setting. One of the most successful examples came on the night of June 17, 1943. A bait convoy, SC-127, was routed through a suspected patrol line off the Azores. The convoy, lightly armed, was flanked not by destroyers but by radar-equipped aircraft flying in long loops beyond visible range. As predicted, U-564 surfaced under cover of darkness, confident in the Metox readings. It transmitted a burst to Kriegsmarine command, alerting others to the soft target. In less than 4 minutes, the location was triangulated by 3 WWII service posts in Newfoundland, Scotland, and Sierra Leone. It was precise to within a few nautical miles. The RAF dispatched a Wellington with lee light. At 0122 hours, the U-boat was caught mid-surface, its hatch still open. The flares lit the Atlantic like a stage. The crew had no time to dive. A single depth charge breached the hull. There were no survivors. And when Allied codebreakers read the response orders from U-boat command the next morning, the mistake was glaring. They had assumed the failure was due to an engine malfunction, not that every radio transmission was painting a bullseye on their decks. This new awareness triggered a change in Allied doctrine. They no longer simply hunted U-boats, they manipulated them. Using captured codes, they began inserting subtle false messages into intercepted traffic. Not full-scale disinformation campaigns, but minor distortions, a misreported weather front, a misaligned supply rendezvous, or a slight shift in convoy timing. These tweaks didn't cause immediate chaos, but they introduced doubt. Doubt forced hesitation. Hesitation got men killed. And the cumulative effect. U-boats began missing convoys by hours. Supply submarines, milch cows, found themselves waiting in empty quadrants. Patrol lines formed in waters already cleared by Allied forces. It was like fighting in a hall of mirrors. The sea hadn't changed, but the mental map inside each U-boat commander's head was quietly, relentlessly corrupted. Even as German engineers raced to improve Enigma's complexity, adding the fourth rotor in the Triton variant, Bletchley Park adapted faster. Alan Turing and his team, now bolstered by hundreds of mathematicians and linguists, used heuristic filters to prioritize decryptions. Messages with certain prefixes, routing codes, or timestamps were flagged for immediate cracking. It meant that a message sent at 2,200 hours by U-501 could be read by British Naval Command by 2245, and acted on by 2300. Real-time warfare. One such decoded message led to the ambush of U-662, whose transmission about a refueling delay betrayed not just its position but that of its milch cow, U-460. In a single night, both were sunk. 2 kills. 0 Allied losses. No one aboard those aircraft ever saw the signals. They only saw explosions. But the quiet victory came days later, when decrypted high command traffic revealed Donit's fury. He couldn't understand how the Allies had predicted the rendezvous. He ordered an internal investigation. The conclusions? Faulty discipline. Complacency. He never suspected Ultra. Not truly. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy intensified its acoustic warfare. The Type 147 Aztec system, an evolution of basic sonar, now measured depth and bearing with deadly precision. Coupled with Hedgehog mortars and Squid launchers, it meant U-boats couldn't just hide, they had to run. And running meant surfacing. Surfacing meant transmitting. And transmitting still meant death. In July, the Allies launched Operation Derange, a network of fake convoys with simulated radio chatter, designed to provoke German U-boat lines into reacting. It worked. U-742, hearing what it believed was a troop convoy passing east of Iceland, moved into intercept position. What it found was a wall of depth charges. The explosion was so violent, oil slicks washed ashore in Reykjavik 3 days later. By August, internal memos from Bletchley to the Admiralty carried a new tone. Not cautious optimism, but confidence. The phrase, predictive interception, appeared in reports for the first time. They weren't reading German mail. They were reading German minds. And yet, even as the Allies surged ahead, they knew victory wasn't guaranteed. One careless operator. One unguarded message. One lucky U-boat, and the advantage could slip. So the pressure never relented. The machines ran 24 hours a day. Wrens rotated in shifts of 4. Every click mattered. At the center of it all, one haunting truth lingered, the signal that started this chain, the rogue transmission by U-564, had lasted just 17 seconds. It was routine. Necessary. Forgotten by the man who sent it. But to the world above, it opened a window. A slit in the armor. And through it poured the full weight of Allied intelligence, strategy, and vengeance. The Atlantic had always been a graveyard. But now, it was a chessboard. And every signal, every silence, every keystroke at a German transmitter was being read not as communication, but as a move. The game wasn't over. But the board had shifted. Forever. By September 1943, the German U-boat arm was no longer a terror, it was a liability. Donitz still issued orders with clipped authority, but the confidence behind them had eroded. There was a new edge in the tone of Kriegsmarine traffic, defensive, erratic, increasingly coded not just in Enigma but in desperation. Allied analysts, watching from the quiet halls of Bletchley Park, began to note a shift in syntax, even before the bomb machines had finished their work. The Germans were improvising. And improvisation was a sign of fear. The British responded with a new level of aggression. Rather than wait for decrypts to confirm U-boat intentions, Allied escort groups began proactively sweeping suspected patrol zones based on past patterns. Captain Frederick John Walker, commanding the 2nd Support Group, pioneered a relentless, looping anti-submarine pattern he called the creeping attack. It relied less on guesswork and more on pressure, a slow tightening of the net, like pulling a noose. His ships would stalk a suspected contact for hours, changing depth and bearing constantly, never allowing a U-boat captain to feel safe enough to surface or escape. Sleep deprivation, stress, psychological erosion. The battlefield was no longer just the ocean, it was inside the minds of the men who hunted and were hunted. By October, a captured U-boat radio operator broke under interrogation. What he described stunned British intelligence. The Germans had developed a reflex to Allied presence, not based on direct detection, but on silence. If a transmission failed to reach command, or if expected chatter from a patrol line went dark, Donitz's staff assumed Allied attack. They weren't even waiting for wreckage or oil slicks anymore. They had become prisoners of the gaps in their own data. The Allies had weaponized absence. And still, Bletchley kept evolving. Alan Turing had moved on to broader computational theory, but his legacy remained in the rows of machines humming day and night. Each decryption was no longer a manual miracle but an industrial process. The work was now as much about software as hardware, human algorithms, priority stacks, predictive modeling. They weren't just reading Enigma. They were simulating it. The turning point came on October 14, 1943. UFA-70 had been shadowing Convoy HX-229 off the coast of Greenland. The convoy had already been attacked twice in the past week, first by aircraft, then by a suspected wolfpack. Morale among the crews was low. But HX-229 wasn't just any convoy. It was bait. The radio traffic was real, the ships genuine, but the cargo was expendable. What mattered was the response. At 0300 hours, UFA-70 broke radio silence to request a tactical update. The transmission lasted 11.4 seconds. What the crew didn't know was that their signal had been picked up by new DF triangulation nodes in Iceland, Newfoundland, and the Azores. Within 7 minutes, a Liberator bomber from RAF Coastal Command was airborne with the coordinates. What followed was a masterclass in convergence warfare. The aircraft located UFA-70 within 35 miles of the predicted zone. Lee light on. Depth charges deployed. The U-boat took evasive maneuvers, attempting a crash dive. But they were already being tracked by sonar buoys dropped from a second aircraft vectoring in from Iceland. It didn't matter that the sea was rough, that visibility was poor. The war had shifted from sight to signal. When UFA-70 surfaced 2 hours later, smoke was already trailing from its aft section. The captain ordered abandon ship. Only 6 men survived. One of them, a young lieutenant named Carl Weber, later told British interrogators he had no idea the Allies could locate a vessel from a single radio burst. He had believed, like many of his comrades, that the sea was still too vast, the technology still too crude. His final words before being sent to a POW camp summed up the collapse of that illusion: the ocean was not big enough anymore. In the aftermath, the Royal Navy published a classified report titled Signal Window Warfare: Strategic Application of Directional Intercepts. It summarized the conflict in brutally clinical terms. Enemy resistance, collapsing. Transmission reliability, exploitable. Enemy command structure, reactive. Recommended action, intensify pressure, exploit silence, feed false positives. It was no longer about beating the U-boats. It was about erasing their presence entirely. At the Admiralty, a debate unfolded. Should the Germans be allowed to believe their codes were still secure? Or should a disinformation campaign be launched, revealing that Enigma had been broken and urging surrender? The answer was neither. Secrecy was power. The longer the Kriegsmarine believed they were simply unlucky, the longer they would continue bleeding resources and morale. By November, U-boat losses reached unsustainable levels. In one 30-day period, 41 submarines were destroyed. 41. Each representing over 40 men, millions in resources, and thousands of man-hours. Hitler was livid. Donitz, once the pride of the Führer, found himself isolated. His reports became shorter. His tone, defensive. He requested additional U-boat production, but factories were being bombed. He requested more air cover, but the Luftwaffe was collapsing. The Atlantic had become a graveyard, and he had no new maps. And still the signals flowed. Messages asking for relief. For resupply. For hope. Each one intercepted, decrypted, mapped, exploited. Room 40 had grown into an empire of silence, a place where the war was fought without a single gun fired. Analysts in starched uniforms drank cold tea as they read the death warrants of men hundreds of miles away, issued not with bullets but with bits. In a final act of defiance, Donitz authorized Operation Himmelreich, a plan to gather surviving U-boats and attempt a mass assault on North Atlantic convoys using the last reserves of torpedoes. The plan relied on synchronized timing, precise coordinates, and tight radio discipline. None of it mattered. The first assembly signal was intercepted within 12 minutes. The Allies let it proceed. They wanted the boats to gather. And when they did, 23 in total, a single ultra-decrypt led to their annihilation over 48 hours. Of the 23, 18 were sunk. 3 were captured. 2 escaped, never to return. The sea grew quiet. but not peaceful. The silence wasn't absence, it was dominance. A victory built not on force, but on listening. The Kriegsmarine had whispered their secrets into the deep. And the deep had whispered them back. By early 1944, the U-boat threat had shifted from apex predator to hunted relic. The Allies no longer feared them as existential weapons. They monitored them like symptoms of a defeated ideology still struggling to breathe. Each intercepted signal wasn't just a target, it was a remnant. Evidence that the machine still twitched, even as its limbs were severed. German submariners, once the terror of the Atlantic, now spoke in whispers aboard vessels that had become steel tombs waiting for a date with pressure and depth. Inside Bletchley Park, the war became quieter, but not less intense. The analysts and Wrens knew the stakes remained astronomical. Each decrypt still carried weight, each radio burst was a pulse in a dying empire's heartbeat. The challenge now was identifying the desperate from the dangerous. The Kriegsmarine had begun deploying new tactics. Acoustic torpedoes. Decoy transmissions. U-boats rigged to remain silent for weeks, only transmitting data via rendezvous points. But it was too late. The Allied signal web had become too thick, too fast, too anticipatory. The Luftwaffe was collapsing. The Heer was being bled dry in Russia. And now the Atlantic belonged not to the wolves but to the watchers. On March 5, 1944, an event occurred that symbolized the total collapse of U-boat operational security. U-859, operating off the coast of Ceylon, transmitted what was thought to be a routine weather update, except the transmission was encrypted using an outdated Enigma key that had already been compromised months earlier. Analysts at Bletchley decoded the message within the hour. They noticed the submarine was far outside its expected range. A special flight of Catalinas from British India was dispatched. 3 days later, U-859 was sunk by a destroyer near Penang. The captain was killed. The entire voyage had served no tactical purpose. It was a ghost mission, lost in a war that no longer had room for ghosts. Even in defeat, the Germans innovated. They introduced the Type XXI Electroboot, faster underwater than on the surface, longer range, quieter engines, snorkel systems. It was a technical marvel. A glimpse of what submarine warfare might become after the war. But in 1944, it was too little, too late. Only a handful were completed before Germany collapsed. They sailed too late to matter. The Allies had already moved on to newer fears, jet aircraft, V-2 rockets, atomic science. The submarine menace that once gripped entire naval doctrines now felt like a holdover from an older war, like cavalry charges in the age of tanks. The intelligence community, meanwhile, grappled with a strange new problem: victory. When the enemy stops talking, what do you listen for? When your adversary's signals disappear, how do you distinguish silence from surrender? They monitored static, watched dead channels, tracked absence like it was presence. They mapped voids. The art of listening had become the art of predicting the last echoes. Entire sections of GCHQ were tasked with nothing more than confirming that nothing had been heard. And in that silence, the legacy of the single radio transmission that had changed everything became clear. That brief, crackling burst in 1943, barely 10 seconds long, had not merely revealed a U-boat's position. It had revealed the shape of the war to come. A war where information moved faster than ships. Where a message could travel 3,000 miles and still be its sender's death sentence. Where encryption was armor and codebreaking was artillery. By May 1945, when Donitz signed the order for all remaining U-boats to surrender, the act was not ceremonial. It was mathematical. The Germans had 1,162 U-boats built during the war. Of those, 784 had been lost. Over 30,000 sailors dead. More than 2/3 of the entire force. The sea had become their grave. The silent service had been buried by noise, by the very signals they relied on to function. In the final days, some U-boat commanders chose to scuttle their vessels rather than hand them over. Others surfaced with white sheets raised on periscopes, surrendering to aircraft that circled overhead like gods of the new ocean. Many had no idea how thoroughly they had been tracked, how easily their messages had been read, how deeply their secrecy had been broken before they even left port. They believed in Enigma. They believed in the depths. But belief had not been enough. The Allies collected the surrendered boats and pored over their equipment. The technology was advanced, sometimes brilliant. But it had never been the machines that lost the war. It was the signals. The words spoken across frequencies that betrayed them. The vulnerability wasn't metal or fuel or torpedoes. It was human. It was the need to be heard. Historians later debated whether it was radar, sonar, aircraft, or depth charges that truly defeated the U-boat threat. But those who worked in the shadows knew the truth. It was a sentence spoken into the Atlantic. A fragment of coordination. A simple, necessary act of command and control. One that reached not its intended recipient, but an unintended ear. The war had been tilted by a whisper. And so, the story of the radio transmission that exposed the German U-boat fleet is not just one of technology or espionage. It is a story of arrogance and assumption. Of men who believed the sea could still hide them. Of a war that moved faster than the ships sailing within it. It is a reminder that in conflict, every word has weight. Every signal leaves a trail. And sometimes, the difference between domination and defeat is not measured in bullets or bombs, but in the decision to press a button and speak.